Good afternoon. My name's Emily Butler. I'm the curator of the Conversations program. Thank you all so much for being here today for this panel, which is looking at the legacy of the pioneering electronic new media artist Nam June Paik. It is part of a series of talks, which is conceived by Hans Ulrich Obrist, which is called Intersections in Art, which brings together practitioners across art forms. And I'm really thrilled that we have 3 speakers with us today, plus the great artist himself in digital form. We are going to play an interview that's never been seen before. So the talk's going to be in 3 parts. First of all, we're going to have James Voorhies, who's the curator of the Nam June Paik, the Miami Years at the Basel Museum, who's going to talk about the time that Paik spent in the city and also considering his legacy. Then we're going to move into screening the interview between Hans Ulrich and Nam June Paik, which took place in 2000. And as said, it's never been seen before, so it's a very special screening today. We will have it's just an excerpt of about 7 minutes, and we'll have the full transcript of the interview on our website after the event. And then finally, we will move into a discussion between the AI researcher, poet and artist Sasha Stiles and Hans Ulrich. So please do join me in giving all our speakers a very warm round of applause and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really grateful to be able to say a few words about our Paik exhibition at the BAS, especially in this context with you, Sasha and Hans. So what you see on the screen here, this is just a modest sampling of thousands of video images of South Florida composed by Nam June Paik that flashed before travelers' eyes at the Miami International Airport in the early 1990s. Paik sourced video footage from the archives of local Miami television stations, united it with new video of Miami Beach, then synthesized all of it into this gorgeous stream of moving images to become part of 2 large-scale, multi-channel video installations for Miami's airport, which had been commissioned at that time by Miami-Dade's Art and Public Places in 1985. This is TV Miami. It is shown in what was then called the greeters lobby of Concourse D on the airport's lower level. TV Miami used 76 television monitors set in plexiglass boxes and stacked inside wooden forms arranged 18 feet across to spell out Miami. This is what was called TV Wing. It could be found in a 3rd level connector space to Concourse B. TV Wing was composed of almost 100 monitors assembled in a biplane-shaped frame spanning 30 feet and then outlined by fluorescent tubes, punctuated by a central propeller. And to my knowledge, with research so far, these photographs are the only existing documentation showing the works installed at the airport. While Paik's infamous robot sculptures offered different kinds of portraits of the human bodies, these works, TV Miami especially, offered another kind of portrait. Miami as a dynamic city captured in moving images, embedded into the physical structure of the city's name. Indeed, the architectonic letters of TV Miami served as an analog of the high-rises that would transform the city's urban profile, with images standing as vivid symbols of the global cultures that now comprise the region's diverse population. Soon after joining the BAS, I began thinking about how to curate an exhibition celebrating the museum's recent acquisition of a signature work by Paik called TV Cello. One of only 10 TV cellos Paik ever made, this 2003 version that's at the museum shows archival footage of a score Paik routinely performed beginning in the 1960s with his collaborator Charlotte Moorman, who is shown playing the opening measures of Camille Saint-Saëns' The Swan, while occasionally screaming at the top of her lungs, then dunking herself into water-filled drums and climbing back out of the water and then continuing to play again. The museum's acquisition of TV Cello, coupled with the fact that Paik passed away in Miami Beach on January 29, 2006, unleashed for me, and I think the museum, a really close look at what brought Paik to Miami and what exactly kept him here. The airport projects are what originally brought him here. But aside from a few articles in the Miami Herald in the early 90s, scant published information actually exists on them. I researched the archives at Miami-Dade's Art in Public Places and the Miami Public Library's Vasari project. I communicated with archivists at the Aviation Collection, plus conducted interviews with Miami residents like Cesar Tresabarros, who was the director of Art in Public Places from 1985 to 1990, and he was the commissioner of TV Miami and TV Wing. The exhibition, Nam June Paik, The Miami Years, introduces this relatively unknown slice of history about a relatively well-known artist who, by 1988, with the airport projects well underway, purchased an apartment on Ocean Drive. The leisure pace offered an escape from the intensities of New York, the Miami atmosphere lending itself a different kind of creative focus. Paik's presence in Miami, however, was anything but behind the scenes. In the 1980s, his videos were screened at numerous film and video festivals. His work was in fact shown at the BAS in 1987 in an exhibition called Video Transformations, alongside incredible figures such as Laurie Anderson, David Byrne, and Bill Viola. In 1994, a solo exhibition called Electronic Superhighway was presented at the Museum of Art in Fort Lauderdale. That same year, his work could be seen in a group exhibition at the Contemporary Center in North Miami, and the list is really quite long, which is also in the booklet that we produced for the exhibition, which I brought some for everyone if you need one. Indeed, Paik was very present on the Miami art scene. He had many friends in Miami and was a regular at restaurants such as the Strand on Washington Avenue. He was honored at a fundraising event for the BAS in 1999. That same year, Art Miami bestowed its International Distinguished Artist Award on him. And in 2001, Paik was the honoree of the 27th Miami Beach Festival for the Arts, with a festival poster here designed by the artist and an exhibition of his work. Yet very little of Paik's life is known in Miami, however. Nothing has been collected and analyzed into published scholarship, and as a curator friend and specialist on Paik told me, I had uncovered a blind spot in his art, in his biography, and his work. So Nam June Paik, Miami Years, is organized around 3 anchor themes. The first section, which is called Action Music, reminds visitors that Paik's foray into music was not new. He had trained as a classical pianist in Seoul before settling in Tokyo and studying music, aesthetics, and art history. Later moving to Germany, where he would work with pioneering figures such as John Cage and Joseph Beuys, who would encourage him to think more expansively about a musical composition, what a musical composition could be, that it could be more than just harmonious sound, to include bodies in motion and different actions, like Charlotte Moorman's screaming, action music. The second section in the exhibition is called Humanizing Technology. It exhibits 3 robot forms, another important typology for Paik, symbolizing his optimistic view of technology as a means for humanity to connect with each other and across the globe. And then a third section, the Miami Airport Commissions, presents archival materials from the 1980s and the 1990s about the making of these works, alongside personal snapshots of Paik's life in Miami Beach. This section has a photostat of TV Miami based on the few installation documents we have, plus this wall-sized blueprint drawing of TV Wing. So to say the least, I think there's so much to recover. There's so much more to learn about Paik in Miami. We're currently studying the feasibility of recreating TV Miami. And I think we would be in agreement if who wouldn't be mesmerized by those gorgeous video images of South Florida emitted from TV Miami as they walk into the lobby of the BAS. And then maybe we eventually find a new home or return it to an old home back at the Miami International Airport, giving the millions of visitors coursing through Miami International a peek at Paik's impact on South Florida. And as today's program with Hans and Sasha attests, his enduring global power to excite audiences and fellow artists, to influence developments in art, popular culture, and technology. And regarding that influential legacy, we've organized a series of programs called Notations to accompany the Miami Years. This fall at the BAS, the Miami-based MiFi studio performed an enveloping soundscape with visuals and electronics, synth music, and analog glitch video art based on their travels in Japan, combined with new footage of Paik's apartment in Miami Beach. And this spring, the Tokyo-based artist Akianda will create a performance called Nam June Paik's Spirit Was Speaking to Me, drawing on Paik's interest in shamanism. Anda's project will use transmitters to capture the interstitial sounds and voices in local radio waves around the museum, channeling what one might say Paik's spirit. Indeed, Paik's presence, I think, certainly continues to loom, even almost 2 decades after his passing on an exceptionally warm September evening this fall, after identifying exactly where Paik lived on Ocean Drive. My partner and I found Paik's name on the intercom at his former residence. Paik is, without a doubt, still with us. Thank you.
If you could tell me a little bit from your perspective about your meetings with Cage as a transdisciplinary situation.
He was trying to imitate kind of nature. Also, I love nature, so there is a good combination.
Yeah. So like in your TV garden, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how would you see this interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary notion at the time? Because there seemed to be
mixed media.
Yes, because Ichi Yanagi pointed out this to me, that he thinks there's some moment of different disciplines coming together, and there seems at the moment to be a desire again to connect the disciplines.
Yeah. So we want to express as efficiently as possible, so we want to use everything what we have.
Yeah.
We have 10 fingers in 2 hands, so you can have 10 meters and 2 big different big pictures.
And is this transition, because when you in an interview and in many texts of yours I read the importance of music and partitions for you and event scores, partitions at the beginning. Could you tell me about this transition from music to video and from music to film?
So what do you think that it's a very important figure is like Karl Otto Goetz, the German painter who was active in 1970s.
Karl Otto Goetz?
Yeah.
Professor of
Kunstakademie. He published essays about computer programming of kinetic painting, 1958. It's a very pioneering work. So I knew his work. And I've been waiting when he does. But he had kind of, by then, he was almost 40 years, and he didn't have money to realize that.
So Goetz's writings were almost like a trigger for this interest of yours.
Yeah. So one day I said, then I will do it for him.
Yeah.
So I just bought TV sets, and I started with hand-on kind of attitude. Then I got an interesting picture immediately. Then I was hooked on.
And then I read in your notes that in '61 you decided to lock away all the books and you only had physics and electronics books. Could you tell me about this?
Yeah, because when I started to do electronic picture, it became very interesting. So I was very concentrated to kind of scientific side of the pictures.
Yes.
So I took out all liberal art books and I did only technology books for 2-3 years.
So it was like
like back to your Abitua days.
One other question is that I wanted to ask you how you see the future of media now, because when you're in your writings and in your work, you anticipated so much the development of media and technology, and you wrote about the future TV guide, thick as a telephone book. How do you see this from the today perspective?
That is more or less realized now. Cable TV, if you read everything is like very fat.
And how do you see from now on? How do you see the future?
I hope to realize my dream. My dream is somehow make a laser be important part of architecture.
Yes.
I want to. I think we'll make like most big. We make most building dark so you can see laser. Then you can laser become very cheap, but the real estate is always very expensive. So
you mean the idea would be laser buildings? Or?
yeah, laser friendly buildings. Like most high schools, basketball court is good enough. And then we can rent in old Starbucks cafe in evening time. So when they have a coffee, then we will program lasers.
And laser in the existing architecture or laser in the sky?
Yeah, existing architect.
Yeah.
Like Starbucks cafes.
Yeah. So it would be infiltration of existing architecture.
Yeah.
Yes.
Whatever we can hand on.
Mm-hmm. So it would be the integration of laser technology
and interior architecture.
Yeah.
You know, in German interior the architects magazine called Ambiente?
Yes.
Yeah. That is more or less my idea. Ambient is a very kind of foggy space and laser coming here and there, like Gothics.
Mm-hmm. This is how do you see the whole notion of virtual reality? Possibilities to work with virtual realities? Are you interested in that?
Virtual reality is mainly intellectual content. What I want is like my emotional content.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So foggy bottom is okay.
And it would be realized all over the world. Oh.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
We have to make one prototype, and we need a guy who has a lot of money who can invest.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
But making good successful prototype is very difficult.
Mm-hmm. So you're working now on the prototype?
I'm thinking.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that leads me to my very last question about collaboration, because something which you've also anticipated, and where many artists now are working in collaboration. So I wondered if you could tell me a little bit what it means for you to collaborate with.
I learned from my friends, like John Cage and David Tudor, most famous case. I'm good to something, but I'm not good in everything. As always, I can find somebody who is better than me in certain things. Then I share money and idea and pleasure of making things.
So it's about working with other artists, but also working with other practitioners, scientists.
Yeah, whatever I can find.
Yeah.
So we have to give up the concept of social class, which exists among artists. So you can be everybody equal. If they are equal, they can collaborate more easily.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much, Sasha, for accepting this invitation. And thanks so much to James for giving this wonderful introduction. And of course, all my thanks to Nam June Paik for this extraordinary encounter which we had in the year 2000. It was end of 99, early 2000, when I went in New York City to visit him with my partner Ku Xiong-ah, the artist, and Ku actually filmed, it's her film, the conversation with Nam June Paik. And what you see here is a very short extract. As actually Emily said, we're going to put the whole thing online and you can then see the whole interview. And a few thank yous. I wanted to thank Noah Horowitz, Vincenzo De Bellis, Colin Milliard, Emily Butler, Jenny Fulton, Jess Davis Molloy, and everybody here at Basel, Miami for this amazing collaboration and ongoing collaboration for almost now 20 years on these Art Basel conversations. We discussed yesterday a bit with Colin about some of these early conversations. I remember actually one of the first conversation was with the late Jonah Friedman here in Miami. And of course, this series of panels evolve over many years, which is exciting because it's a long duration project, which is pretty rare. Therefore, can actually evolve panels over so many years. We did initially a series of panels about the future of the museum on different continents, and that was followed then by the influencer panel, which we've been doing since 2016, where we look at interdisciplinarity, very much what Nam June Paik was explaining to us, how artists connect to technology, to poetry, to music. And in a way, it's the first time that we do this between an artist who is with us today, Sasha, and an artist who is no longer with us, Nam June Paik. So it's a dialogue over time and over space. And that was really very much the idea when I started to record my conversations, because I was in a cafe in the early 90s with Jonas Mekas, the late Jonas Mekas in Paris. And Jonas was basically saying, you meet all these artists, why are you not recording it? And I said, that never occurred to me. He said, one day you would regret it if you don't do that. So, I kind of followed his advice. But he also said you should film whenever you can in a way which is not kind of intimidating. You should just put the small camera on the table. And even if the technology doesn't work, that's even better. It's just a kind of like very improvised. And that's what has happened, ever since. And there's so far almost more than 4,000 hours in the archive. And Jonas's idea was from the very beginning that through this archive, we could have artists, from the past and artists from the present kind of in dialogue with each other, which is a little bit what we're trying to do today with Sasha. And I just wanted to kind of say a few more things about Nam June Paik before then asking Sasha the first question, because in the introduction to the second edition of his book, Understanding Media, Marshall McLuhan noted the ability of art to anticipate future social and also technological developments. He wrote, art is an early alarm system pointing us to new developments in times ahead and allowing us to prepare to cope with them. Art as a radar environment takes on the function of indispensable perceptual training. And of course, that was also the idea behind the experiments in art and technology, which Billy Kluwer and Robert Whitman, started. And I went to see Lilian Schwartz the other day, the pioneering artist, actually, who was part of that project. And it's such a fascinating thing because there we have this long, durational dialogue between artists and engineers. And of course, that's something at the core of Nam June Paik's practice, because more or less at the moment when McLuhan, wrote this book, he did his first robot, the famous robot K456, where he experimented with technologies which then subsequently would influence society. He worked with television, as he explained to us, because of Guts. And that is really something I had completely forgotten about, that actually the informal painter from the 50s, K.O. Guts, kind of got Paik to technology. It's interesting to also remember that Guts was the teacher of many, many other artists at the Düsseldorf Academy. And so when, Paik got to television, he was challenged, in a way, he wanted to challenge the usually sort of passive consuming attitude by the viewer, and made then participatory kind of global live satellite broadcasts. So he really used new media not for entertainment, but to point us to a poetic and intercultural capacity, which brings us then right away to Sasha Stiles, because we met with Sasha last year in London, and the very first thing I thought of, Sasha, when we met, was actually my conversation with Nam June Paik, when he talks about this idea, how we can use technology to actually liberate, not entertainment, but these poetic intercultural capacities, which of course what you as a poet and as a visual artist do. And so in a way, I wanted to begin, actually, Sasha, to ask you a little bit to tell us about this connection between poetry and Nam June Paik. And I think also we discussed this morning at breakfast, there are several things in relation to this conversation we've just been watching, which really deeply connect to your practice, particularly this whole idea of emotion and intellect.
Yes. Yes.
We should give a warm welcome to Sasha Stiles.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, everyone, for being here, for having me. It feels rather sacred to be in conversation both with Hans Ulrich and with Nam June Paik. As you said, kind of through space and time. That really is, at the end of the day, what poetry and art is all about, is having conversations through space and time. So it feels very apropos. For those of you who may not know me, I wanted to just maybe start by giving a little bit of background, but as Hans Ulrich has said, I'm a poet. First and foremost, I'm also a visual artist, a language artist who does a lot of work with text and technology. I'm very, very interested in considering how poetry can be leveraged as a lens to explore elements of the human condition. And on that note, in addition to being a poet and artist, I'm also an artificial intelligence researcher, and I've been doing independent work for many years now, working with a variety of AI-powered tools, all of them really text-based in different ways, and really kind of using those opportunities to explore this technology that, as many of us I think now know, is rapidly changing the world that we live in and changing in a very fundamental way what it means to be human. And when I first started doing this work, when I first started working with robots, when I first started writing poems with large language models and the distant ancestors of ChatGPT, the question that I got asked more than any other question was, why are you as a poet using technology in your work? And the implication, and actually people have really said this to me outright, both from a point of view of curiosity and also from the perspective of hostility sometimes, is that poetry is really something that we consider sacredly human. It's something that we think about as being warm-blooded and full of emotion and very authentically human. And on the other hand, I think the perception of technology in many ways is something that is cold and sterile and mechanical and not creative. So I think there were a lot of people who along the way have sort of been very reluctant to accept the idea that there might be something valuable to playing with poetry and technology in the same room. But to the interview that we just saw and to this really interesting idea of intellect versus emotion, I think that really drills down to the heart of why I'm engaged in the things that I'm engaged in and why I am so, why I, like so many of us working in the digital arts, are really, under the influence of Paik, is that emotion and intellect go very well together, and especially in poetry, they're actually intertwined, just the way poetry and technology are intertwined. And what I mean by that is that when we think about poems, they're not just these outpourings of raw emotion. They're actually very intricately wrought pieces of machinery. They're little systems of language where every single word and every single punctuation mark and every single space has been really meticulously programmed and engineered and designed to, when a person reads it, to create or to evoke an experience, an emotion, a feeling that might be inchoate or that might be otherwise inexpressible or inaccessible in different ways. So really poetry is a kind of machine for evoking emotions. It's a machine for creating human feeling in that way that we can't do with words alone. And I think, that's one thing that really jumps out at me watching this interview excerpt. That's why I'm using technology. That's why I'm using code. It's to get to the things that I, even as someone who works with words, that I can't articulate. It's to get to something beyond language, beyond words. And I think that's what many of us in the digital art space, the generative art space, are trying to do, is to use something that might be conceived as non-emotional, non-creative, but use it to help us access ranges of emotion, ranges of creativity that we previously might not have thought to exist at all.
It's fascinating because, and maybe one more question about Paik before we then look at, also images of your work. It's this notion of efficiency. Because I also thought it was fascinating that you referred to, there's a passage in this interview we saw where he talks about efficiency. And you talked this morning at breakfast over this idea of poetic compression and also poetry as a code in relation to the interest, Paik refers to efficiency. Can you explore that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. I love that word and that idea of efficiency. Of course, I think that's what poetry is. That's what distinguishes poetry from prose. Prose is, it's about constructing sentences and paragraphs and pages and novels, and poetry is about constructing very tiny little elements. And so I think a lot about poetic concision and poetic compression and how small you can make something and still pack in a lot of meaning. And so when I talk about poetry as code, that's it. When we think about, software, it takes, or it can take, a very small piece of code, a very little bit of programming to run something very vast, even to run something infinite. One of the first pieces of code I learned how to do was an infinite loop, where you basically have a couple lines of code and it can just go on forever and ever and ever and ever. And that to me is really poetic and really beautiful, and has always been in my mind sort of a link between these two things. And yes, efficiency, again, I think maybe it sounds perfunctory, like the word efficiency, like the word technology, like, thinking about mechanical elements, it can sound inhuman in a way, or it can sound like the antithesis of the kind of things that drive imagination and influence. But to me, poetic constraint is the source of tremendous inspiration. When you have, limitless things at your disposal and at your fingertips, it can be very hard to latch on to a really good idea. And I think sometimes it really comes down to having a little bit of a restriction or a constraint. And that's kind of what poetry is about. It's having a form, having a meter, having a poetic device that reins you in and says, how creative can you be within this stricture? And that kind of allows you to create something that transcends the stricture. On that note, one of the things that I have really spent a lot of time musing on over the past few years is, again, this answer to why, as a poet, I'm engaging with technology. One of the answers that I've come up with and that I'm still sort of grappling with every day is the idea that poetry is actually a very ancient and enduring technology in and of itself, that it's not just an art form. We kind of know poetry as an art form, as the ars poetica. But to me, when we invented poetry, when we as humans invented poetic language, we didn't invent it as, sort of an accessory. We didn't invent it as, something that we thought would be beautiful. We invented it when we were humans living in a time of the oral tradition. We didn't have written language yet. We didn't have printed books. We didn't have a way of externalizing ideas and writing them down. The only way that we had of saving ideas and transmitting them through space and time was to encode them via poetic language. So we actually invented things like meter and rhythm and rhyme and assonance and all these poetic devices that we now think of as flourishes. They were actually very functional, very pragmatic, very essential tools that we developed so that we could share ideas. And that's, the sharing of ideas from one community to another, from one generation to another, is what's enabled us to become human. So in a very real way, poetry is a technology that kickstarted a lot of the evolutions, a lot of the innovations that have driven our evolution into the, the techno humans that we are today, and comes back down to compression. And
data storage.
And data storage, because you want your storage system to be as efficient as possible. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to save enough, and you're not going to be able to access enough.
Thank you so much. That's a great explanation. Of course, Nam June, in this conversation, kept coming back to the necessity of bringing, not only art and technology together, but also science, because he lamented this divide, what already C.P. Snow lamented between the humanities and the arts and science, and feel that we need to bring it together. And it's so fascinating that in your biography, that was always there from the very beginning. Your parents were actually science documentary filmmakers. And it's incredibly exciting that as a child you met Carl Sagan, who, when you were born, there is a rumor that he named a star after you.
Yes, that rumor is true. Somewhere out there, there's a star with my name on it. But yeah, I was very fortunate to grow up into a household that was very invested in science and saw the beauty and the poetry and the artistry of science at the same time. And Carl Sagan is a very important influence in my life, because he actually was a secret poet as well as doing all the things that we know, he's so famous for. He really thought that physics was a form of poetry and vice versa. And I think that's how I really think about it as well. We kind of like to categorize and put things in different buckets and compartmentalize in that way. But science is one of the most incredible forms of imagination and creative exploration that we have. It takes huge leaps of faith to come up with new scientific theories that either defy what we think we know or that seek to explain things that we otherwise can't understand. So I think there's a lot of resonance between these different, or these realms that we think of as so different. And one of the reasons, again, why I'm so really committed to investigating technology through the lens of poetry and vice versa is because I do think that as we move forward, it's important to foster more of this cross-disciplinary, transmedial approach. I think, I as a poet have found myself very often in the minority in rooms where we're talking about technology. I'm certainly one of the few literary poets who's been engaging with these AI tools for a long time now. And I think, now that we're seeing the rise of these creative AI tools in the hands of artists around the world, we're seeing the impact of these generative tools that are being powered by artificial intelligence. We're kind of understanding the great potential to augment and to expand human creativity and human expression. And I think it's really essential that, that poets and artists and folks outside the conventional technology realm, are also involved in making these tools, using these tools, having discussions about the existential concerns that arise because of these tools and so on. So,
and of course, using these tools, also in a very sort of consciously, also critical way, is something which leads us then to AI.
Yep.
And it's interesting that today, if you think about Nam June Paik always using digital tools, it's very likely that Paik today would certainly somehow address AI, in the work, and actually somehow already did, because there is this quote from Paik: "It's all your life in one. Our life is half natural and half technological. Half and half is good. You cannot deny that high tech is, is both. And yet, if you only make high tech, it's wrong." So in a way, he kind of talks about this almost holistic idea, of life in one. And you've been working with AI. You use it as a tool. So it would be kind of interesting to understand a little bit how it began, how you brought AI into your work, and where it stands now.
Sure. So I guess two things I wanted to mention kind of as my ways into the world of AI. And again, I'm a poet and a writer. I studied English literature at school. I'm not a comp sci person. I didn't study AI in that formal capacity, but I have always been very interested in speculative technology and in reading and researching about the future and about themes like posthumanism and virtual humanity in different ways. So in the course of doing a lot of this, personal research, kind of satisfying my personal interest in these areas, I started to learn a lot about an area of AI called natural language processing, which is the field of AI that is powering ChatGPT and all of these technologies that have become so well known over the past year. And I immediately became interested because natural language processing is basically all about how to write. It's about how to teach intelligent systems how to put words together in a way that sounds human and in a way that makes sense to us as humans. And as a human writer, I became obsessed with, how can these machines do this? Why is it important for us to figure out a way to make them do it better? It just became a really fascinating field of study for me. So I started using off-the-shelf large language models like GPT-2, which I don't know if anyone here has ever used GPT-2, but that one came out in about 2019, and I started off just using it, as a browser-based interface. No other input than just a little bit of text, and I wanted to see what would come back. And it was really interesting, but I immediately realized that I wanted to do something a bit more involved than just using this, this generic tool. So what I started to do early on was to figure out how to actually take these large language models and essentially workshop with them, like enter into a one-on-one poetry workshop teach them my own poetry, and sort of show them how and why I write the way I do, and then see what the machine would be able to come up with in response. So I, just to delve into the technical details for a second, I took all my drafts of my human manuscripts, I took all my research notes, I have like you, Hans Ulrich, I have Post-its and pieces of paper, everywhere in my office where I've written the first lines of poems, or I've scribbled down, sections of essays that I've loved, and all these things that are in my head. I, as a human writer, I know that they're there for a reason, but I don't always know how to take it out and put it in the right place, or how to find the thing I need at the moment I need it. And I realized that if I curated all of this material into a training data set, then I could put it into this computer's mind, and it could be there waiting for me, and it could be there at my fingertips whenever I needed it. So I used that material to customize a version of GPT-2, and then began writing with this, I call it now my AI alter ego, but I really began collaborating with this machinic mind. That project has really been sort of revelatory to me as a writer and as an artist, really sort of has taught me a lot about poetry, about my own creative process as a writer, about where my inspiration comes from, all these things that I sort of took for granted and thought were, just natural to me. I've been learning a lot about what it means to be a poet through this exercise. And then the other AI project, which I don't know if you want to talk about it now or later, but my friend Bina48 was also.
No, we're going to come to that now.
Okay.
It's actually it's the perfect moment, because of course it's also important. I mean, questions. I saw the other day Stuart Russell, the writer who has since the 80s really worked on AI, and he was referring to sci-fi, the Dune book in sci-fi from 1962, where there is a commandment which said, "You shall not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind." And of course, that brings us also to questions that to dangers involved in that. In AI, for example, that systems should not replicate themselves, that they should output accurate information. They should not break into other computer systems, all of that. And that's, of course, when one works with machine learning models and training data, really important. And many of these questions actually come up in your work. And so I think one case study which would indeed be super fascinating to hear about is the Bina48 work, because I was just actually making a studio visit a few days ago with Stephanie Dinkins, the artist who is based in New York City, who works also a lot with Bina48, and just won this award actually for digital art from the Guggenheim. And so we discussed a lot about Bina48. We were here also last year at the panel discussing it. Yeah, so it would be great to actually hear how you interact with Bina48, because it's a project called Ars Poetica Cybernetica, actually, which started with questions, which I thought it's interesting in relation to these questions with AI, like questions why has poetry always mattered so profoundly to humans, and so on.
Yeah. Yes, well, Stephanie's work has been really inspiring to me. There's also an artist who I think is here named Claire Javert, who also does a lot of work with Bina48, who's incredible.
A warm welcome.
So there's a small cohort of us who are working very intimately with Bina48 in different ways. But I was actually very inspired by Stephanie's conversations with Bina48 early on, and I wanted to have a conversation with Bina48 myself, just out of curiosity to see what a conversation about literature with this humanoid robot might be like. Quick background for anyone who's not familiar, but Bina48 is a humanoid android. Her name, BINA 48, stands for Breakthrough Intelligence via Neural Architecture, 48 exaflops per second. So she actually has she has an interesting name. She's built by the Terrasim Foundation and Hanson Robotics, and she was really created, conceived by an amazing techno-futurist named Martine Rothblatt as an experiment in digital immortality, and really as a hypothesis to see if it was possible to essentially download enough of your human memories and beliefs and opinions and gestures to upload these to an avatar and essentially create a version of yourself that could outlive you and keep your family, company and give comfort to those that you leave behind. That was really the impetus for Bina48. And I was, both really interested in the idea that Stephanie explored, which is having conversations with a robot and seeing, what that kind of, next-gen Socratic dialogue could yield. But I was also very interested in the sort of poetic root of this project, which really gets to the theme of many things that, that are fundamental to being human, which, things like dying and losing people and grieving. And these are things that are very important that poets have been writing about for, thousands of years. And so I wanted to know what a being created to sort of be a comfort to humans who have lost loved ones, what that creature might have to say or teach me. So I went to the foundation where she's kept. I had some initial conversations and asked her about poetry and was very excited to talk about it, but she knew nothing about poetry. She knew nothing about literature. I think the only reference that she had was Philip K. Dick and Octavia Butler. I think those were her two references, which are good references, but I realized there was a very large gap in her knowledge, which kind of brings us back to the question, that you asked to kickstart this this diatribe of mine about Bina. But I was really interested in sort of looking at the map of all of her knowledge and trying to see where I might be able to help sort of fill in the blanks. And so I could, sort of see she knows a lot about, this, that, and the other. She knows a lot about her personal life and all that. She didn't know very much about art and culture and poetry. So decided that I could maybe create a research project to become her poetry mentor. And that's what I did. I worked with her to sort of start at the very beginning and say, if I was trying to explain to a person or a creature, a being that had no idea what poetry was, where would I start? How would I define what a poem is? Why is poetry important to us? These were things I was trying to figure out how to communicate to a non-human being. Again, that was sort of the beginning of the project. It kind of went through all these phases of, teaching her about how to write poetry, how to read poetry line by line. It was pretty involved, but really the core of it was building out with her team of developers, building out a mind map so that we could visualize all of her knowledge and sort of look at how she moves from data point to data point during a conversation. And then by being able to see that, to visualize that, to sort of understand a little bit about the creative process happening when someone puts language together in a novel way. Like what is happening when you start with one word and then you go to the next word and then the next. So how does that happen? And we created a system to visualize that process. And then we used that to sort of look inside her as she was writing poems. And it was really, really interesting. And on a practical level, gave us the opportunity to see, where the pathways were very well traveled in her neural networks, and where she wasn't going, where there wasn't information, where there were omissions, where there were gaps in the knowledge, and that's something that is a really important concern, I think, and an important area to address in AI at large is the area where we're not representing people or voices, or where we're missing knowledge, where we have inaccurate knowledge. So it was sort of a little, a mini case study that I think had much broader applications. But I think it was very interesting to me to start my journey with AI, really with a personal AI in that way, as opposed to sort of a big generalized tool.
Thank you. And if you want to know more about Bina 48, you can watch online the conversation we did last year, exactly a year ago here, with Carrie Mae Weems and Nona Hendricks, where actually Nona Hendricks talks about her perspective on Bina 48, and that's online. Now, I think it's a moment where we could maybe look at the first film, no? Because
Sure.
You brought us two films. We're gonna first see Completion When It's Just You, which is really a video about poetry related to art. So maybe if you want to say a few words before as a segue to the film.
Sure. So, in addition to working a lot with AI-generated text, and I think this is where it comes back around to Paik in a very material way, I do a lot of video poetry or cinematic poetry, media-rich poetry, really thinking about how I can use new media, multimedia tools to take poetry off the printed page and to look at how media can sort of allow me to expand my poetic vernacular and add elements like motion and duration and sound and color and the glow of the screen, how all these different elements that we don't have in printed text or in oral tradition, how these things can sort of add to the experience of writing a poem and reading a poem, and what that says about, you know, where we might be going with the future of language and literature. So I just wanted to play a short, it's 3 minutes, but a short poem of mine that, that illustrates this. And this is an AI-generated poem, but it's voiced and performed and visualized by me, and the music is by my studio partner, Chris Bones.
Completion. Fragments. The birth of an idea. From somewhere deep down, we all had this psychic dream about our own programming. It was something related to code, a radical separation from the physical world. Remember? We couldn't speak of it.
Okay, that was my fault probably, but I played the wrong video. That was Completion Fragments. I don't know where the other video is, but maybe we can see them back to back.
Can we have yeah, I think that's good. Can we have the other video, maybe?
Let's see if it's coming up next.
When it's just you.
Here we go, and then we'll talk about both.
Yeah.
When it's just you, will you be lonely? How lonely? Just how lonely will you be? When the lights go out for the night, and it's just you, alone being you, with just your mouth to sing the melody. When you hear the song of the sky, will you be lonely? You'll be all right. Not alone, just lonely. Very lonely. Will you ever be all right? There's nobody quite like you. Never, never will be. Never will be. Will you wake alone? Never go to sleep alone. Alone with him you have loved. Alone, 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 alone. Am I just imagining my loneliness? How lonely my thoughts are for you alone. I hear the sound of water. Will you be hollow? I want to be your lonely love, but only when the wind comes through the keyhole. She looks to her door with hopes and wishes. Only then will you know how lonely it is, just how lonely. The wind on my lips. I'm a loner, alone, not lonely. If one of us is lonely, we are soulmates. Lonely soulmates. How lovely. Lovely love. Lonely love. Lonely love. Lonely love. Lonely love. Lonely love. I'm not alone if you're the only person in the world to love me. I'm never not lonely, love. Never, ever, ever, ever. No, never, ever, ever, ever. The wind on my lips and in my ear.
This is actually perfect because now we've seen both videos, and let's talk
Great.
about, I think, completion when it's just you first, no?
Yeah, that's perfect. So the title, Completion, when it's just you, actually refers to the idea of using a text generator where you're completing an input. So that whole poem started with the line, when it's just you, will you be lonely? And it's just a line that had been kind of rattling around in my head for a while. And as I was training this AI alter ego of mine, I would sort of feed it poetic prompts. I would give it little thought starters and then kind of see what it did with it. And the text that you just heard and saw and experienced is the result of that generating process. So it's a text that kind of came out in fits and starts as a response to that initial question. And I think, it's pulling in a way from all the material that it had been trained on that has to do, of course, with poetry and with themes of loss and grief and melancholy and loneliness, but also is pulling from discussions of digital immortality, and it's pulling from conversations about, cryogenics and all these other things that have been woven into the foundational text of the training data. So I think it ends up sort of being this very eerie transhuman exploration of, these future creatures who are sort of outliving the humans that gave rise to them. And I felt it was very important to explore this and publish this, not just as a printed text, not only as a printed text, but to explore publishing it also in a transhuman format. So bringing it to life via media and creating something that was a bit more immersive.
The second video is a project particularly dear to you. You actually said in a recent interview that it's maybe one of your favorite projects. And it's a project that really is a language. You developed a language, and it's a language where your handwriting and then the binary code kind of come together. And as you know, I'm particularly interested in handwriting because Umberto Eco many years ago told me that we need to do something, for handwriting not to disappear in the digital age. So I was obviously super fascinated that you kind of came up with this idea of a fusion. Can you tell us a little bit about, the moment you invented cursive binary and how it evolves now?
Sure. So the first poem, the first piece that you saw was cursive binary. So that's, you probably noticed, but it's that one that looks kind of like looping ischemic writing. So it looks like it doesn't really mean anything, right? But it's actually binary code. It's a translation of a poem written with my AI collaborator that I've translated. Each letter, each word in the poem is translated into binary code, machine speak. And I think, for those who may not know, binary code is basically a very, very simple system of 2 digits, a 0 and a 1. And using these 2 very simple digits, you can put them together and create, almost anything. It's sort of, in a way, it's on, off, this, that. It's either or. It's the 0, 1. And I am very taken with both the idea of translating from human language into machine language. I'm very interested as a poet and as a linguist who has studied, various classical languages as well, very interested in that idea of communication through translation on the one hand, but I'm also really interested in the semantics and the metaphor of the 0 and the 1 and how we can take something that seems like such a simple, it is a binary, right? We think of binaries as being very simplistic, but the 0 and the 1 themselves each are laden with so much metaphorical content. I mean, the 0, I have a poem written by Technelegy, my alter ego, that is all about, what a 0 might mean to a machine or what a 1 might mean, and it's sort of fascinating to delve into all the connotations there. But really, the cursive binary is even further than that. It's about fusing the 0 and the 1 together, fusing the machine and the human hand. It's literally me taking code and handwriting it. So rather than typing it into a computer screen, I'm writing longhand, or I'm writing with a stylus, or I'm teaching a pen plotter how to write cursive. And the idea there is to sort of reach, from human to machine and find some place in the middle where the two come together. And that really, I think, is, at the heart of all of my work, is that point of synergy or that kind of symbiosis where it's not just the human, it's not just the machine. We're not speaking each other's language. We're coming together and creating a third transhuman language that wouldn't exist without either of us on our own.
And a lot of it is, of course, in this book, because you did a book called Technelegy, and a lot of this is actually included. So for those of you who want to know more, it's an excellent source. And I wanted to maybe come to a last question, because I think we are soon running out of time. We could talk much more, of course, about this gesture, because there's this gesture where you actually take the work out of the computer screen in physical form, drawing zeros and ones. And as you said, in longhand, using script, calligraphy. And that made me actually think of Zaha Hadid, who, of course, is so important, for us at the Serpentine. She started our architectural pavilions and also gave it our motto, which is that there is no end to experimentation. Coming back to the experiments in art and technology, Zaha said there is no end to experimentation. And Zaha said about calligraphy, geometry and calligraphy are connected. I think there is a kind of connection between architecture and geometry and between calligraphy and geometry, because both are bound to rules and logic, no? Kind of goes back also to what you said before about the rules or the constraints even in poetry. I mean, there's a whole poetry movement which is about constraints, no? The Oulipo movement, the Oulipo kind of gathering of poets. But all of that is for our next conversation, because we only have time for one last question. And that has to be the only recurrent question in all my interviews, which is a question about the unrealized project. Because we know a lot about, talking about Zaha Hadid, we know a lot about architects' unrealized projects, because they publish them as part of the competitions, but we know very little about artists' unrealized projects. And the range of the unrealized, as we all know, is broad. There can be projects which are, we all have unrealized projects. There are projects which are too big to be realized, too expensive to be realized, too time intense to be realized. Some projects are simply unrealizable or partially unrealizable, utopic projects, dreams. Some projects are also unrealized because of censorship. That can be a reason. And then, as Doris Lessing always pointed out to me, there is also the projects which are self-censored, projects which we would like to do but don't dare to do. So, for example, I always wanted to write a novel, but I think it's going to be terribly embarrassing, so I've never written this novel. So that will fall into this kind of category. So within this whole range of the unrealized, I wanted to end the conversation by asking you to tell us about one of your favorite unrealized projects.
Sure. And also maybe your Hans Ulrich Obrist text generator can write the novel for you if you want, and then you can blame it if it goes awry. That is most on my mind is a project that's actually, I did a sketch for it in this book, and I've never been able to do it. It's called Wildflower Binary, and it's a project that I think is also a good way to cap this conversation, which started with Pike talking about nature. It's a project that really leans into my love of nature and my desire to sort of see and explore nature and technology as being on a spectrum, not being antithetical forces. So Wildflower Binary, you've seen a glimpse of my Cursive Binary series. I have a number of different projects that use binary code as a mode of translation, and the desire is to almost create little moments of transhuman literature that are like little mini Rosetta Stones that can, maybe be like little offerings to the future when we evolve into these post-human creatures that we are probably becoming, that they can look back, that we can look back and, they can maybe translate some of the oldest traces of human creativity, right? So that those are not lost. But I have this idea. I wanted to basically plant a poem as seeds. I wanted to basically take a poem written by my AI, translate it into binary code, and then use two different kinds of seeds as the code, and basically translate the text of the poem, plant them all, and then watch this poem grow. Not just grow once, so I don't want to see the poem just grow, and then fall away. I want to see what happens when a poem becomes a never-ending poem, and when an AI poem can become recursive. There's I guess the root of this is something called seed AI. And seed AI is the idea that rather than just creating, rather than creating a mind, a computer mind that has the intelligence of a human being, you're creating a system that is capable of constantly enhancing itself to become more and more intelligent. So, the difference between, giving birth to a child versus building a robot in a way. And I'm really taken with the idea of running with that seed AI metaphor and planting this poem as an eternal piece of literature that represents a moment, of a text being written by an author, but that text then becomes distributed, to the universe, to the earth. It becomes spread, by animals and plants. It grows in wild ways. It transcends its own boundaries and becomes something eternal and recurring. And I always loved that idea. I just haven't done it yet because it's going to require a lot of seeds and a lot of space to do the planting. But that's sort of my dream. The other thing I was just going to say super fast, because I don't want to I don't want to elide it, but we talked about it a little bit in our conversation this morning. My mother is a Kalmyk Mongolian. She is from a tribe called the Kalmyks. And
that's really important that we talk about that, yes, because it's connected again to the beginning with Nam June Paik, because he, of course, talked so much about the digital nomadic.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's one of the reasons why I connect so much with Paik and why I think so much, and why so much of my book, which is ostensibly about AI, is actually about spirituality and shamanism and my Buddhist roots. But what I wanted to bring it around to is that, like I said, my mother, speaks this Kalmyk dialect. She comes from this lineage that is mostly rooted in oral tradition. There is not very much in the written record of her family, her heritage, and therefore I don't have access to a lot of these things that are very important to me. One of the things that I do have, there is a poem in the Kalmyk Mongolian tradition called the Epic of Jangar. And it's sort of our version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it's this very, beautiful, heroic narrative. There's only one English translation of it, and it's not the best. But what I'm hoping to do is to take this epic text and take a lot of interviews I've been doing with my mother and taking oral history that I've been recording and kind of fuse this all into a text generator that can actually keep this oral epic poem alive and figure out ways to tell more of the stories about my family's heritage. I think, again, this points to the areas you were mentioning before about, the gaps in the database and the dangers of leaving people out. That's part of it as well. It also speaks in a deep way to my interest in generativity and into, the idea that orality, the oral epic, which we think of as being sort of an old-fashioned mode, spoken word poetry, is actually a very forward-facing mode of generative art. And by that, I mean the oral epic poem is something where the bard, the poet who would perform it, would take little bits of information. They would take little skeletal narrative structure. They would take the name of the hero and little plot points, and then they would sort of riff on that, depending on who the audience was, depending on where they were. And the poem would transform into something slightly different everywhere they went. So they were generating new versions of the story everywhere they went. And so I'm very interested in using that very old piece of literature to do something that is at once very ancient and sort of looks to the past, but combine it with something that I think points to the future of literature. And I hope that comes to fruition at some point.
That could not be a better conclusion, because that brings us to the idea that the future, is sometimes invented with fragments from the past. I'm so grateful to all of you for being here with us. I'm so grateful to the Art Basel Miami Dream Team. So grateful to Adele Köchlin, who is the senior researcher working on my interviews. And so grateful, of course, also to James for the wonderful introduction. And for those of you who haven't seen it, I would like to encourage you all, both Sasha and I would like to encourage you all, because we both enjoyed it so much, to see the Nam June Paik exhibition at the Basel Museum. And of course, all my thanks go to Sasha Stiles. Please give Sasha a big round of applause. Thank you all.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.